Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics. Thank you so much for being here. You know, there's a decent amount of confusion and I still get a lot of questions about what size sponge filter, how many gallons per hour should we run through an aquarium. And when it comes to sponge filters, gallons per hour doesn't mean a whole lot. Let me show you why. All right, so as we look around the fish room here, yeah, it is still in the process of transformation. This center island is going to be gone pretty soon. But if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that we use sponge filters in this fish room as the primary source of filtration. And I get a lot of questions about sponge filters. How large should they be? How many gallons per hour? What about the fish tank ratings, like the sizes? And I would say those things are really hard to do when it comes to sponge filters. In terms of manufacturers having to figure out, well, what size sponge filter for what size tank. So let me kind of just show you what I'm talking about. Now, the smallest tank I have in here right now is a 20 gallon, but if I had a 10-gallon aquarium, I would probably go with something similar to the ATI Hydro 1. And I'll put the sizes up on the screen for you. And I would just use one of them. And if I had a 20 gallon, I would probably do what I'm doing here. And that would be something similar to the ATI Hydro 2. And that's what I have in every one of these 20-gallon aquariums are the ATI Hydro 2s. And you'll see that I just have one of them and they're kind of placed in the corner. Ideally, if I was trying to maximize the sponge filter's impact on the aquarium, it might be better with these to put them right in the center of the aquarium as opposed to one side. But a lot of people don't want to look at sponge filters in their aquarium, so they just try to tuck them away. And that's what we do too. So when it comes to gallons per hour, it's all about the pump. And we in the fish room have this big central air pump here that is from Gemco. And so this is what's partially controlling the airflow. But then for each individual tank, we have the air eyelet right here, and this little valve right here, this air valve, will control how much is going into the aquarium. Now there is two schools of thought here when it comes to how much flow you should have going through your sponge filters. One school of thought is if the air is a little bit lower, the water is moving through slower, that's going to provide a greater opportunity for beneficial microbes that are in your filter to come across the ammonia and the nitrite that's in your aquarium. However, the other school of thought, and I think it is just as valid, is if you have a sponge filter that has air flowing through a little faster and the water's coming through faster, you're going to get more volume of water through the sponge filter. And so in the end, when it comes to biological filtration, it's kind of a wash, and I would actually agree with that. I don't really think the amount of flow going through your sponge filter is going to matter when it comes to biological filtration. I've never had an ammonia spike by running them slower. I've never had an ammonia spike by running them faster. And you can see here I tend to move them a little faster. The air goes through faster, more water flow through the sponge filter. So why do I do that? Well, reason number one, and probably the primary reason, is the faster you move the water through, the more surface agitation you're going to have. And it's not the bubbles of the sponge filter that's actually creating aeration in your tank. Those bubbles are just popping at the surface. What's creating the airflow and the gas exchange in your aquarium is when those bubbles break, you've got surface agitation there, and that is what's giving your aquarium the ability to release CO2 and bring in oxygen. And so that's really the primary driver here. Now you're going to notice on a lot of our sponge filters, we do not have the Uplift tubes, those little plastic tubes. I'll show you one right here. Kind of hard to see, but you can see right there, that is an Uplift tube, but most of our sponge filters do not have those. And the reason they don't is we find that most of our tanks, they have bristlenose plecos. They can get stuck in there. Some of the loaches that we have will get stuck in there to the point where they really can't get out. And I'll show you what I mean here. Here's a couple. They're not running. They're just kind of in there to stay cycled. Uplift tubes right there. So some of our tanks do, but especially when we were quarantining a lot of fish from import, I just found it to be a bigger hassle than what it was worth. Now the argument for the Uplift tubes, and we've got them right here, is that you're going to get better flow through the sponge filter. And that's a valid argument. But again, I just don't think it makes a big enough difference to really matter. And so I don't care if the Uplift tubes are on the sponge filters, quite frankly, or not. And again, that's why most of our tanks don't have the Uplift tubes on the sponge filters. And so there's really not any one reason why I don't have them on there right now, because we're not really quarantining fish, but I haven't put them back on. I probably won't. So back to our sizes again. If I've got a 20 gallon, I've got one ATI Hydro 2. And again, I've put the sizes up there for you already. But by the time I get to a 3-foot tank, like these 40 gallon breeders here, a lot of sponge filters will say, and like these ATI Hydro 4s I have in here, hey, that's good for like up to 80 gallons. And it certainly is for biological filtration. The problem is mechanical filtration isn't the best with a sponge filter. In fact, of all the filtration, it ranks near the bottom. And so to keep water movement going and to keep the mechanical filtration, the water looking kind of clear in our tanks to the best of its ability, I like to have 2 sponge filters, and usually I would run 2 ATI Hydro 4s in a 40 gallon breeder, because now I'm getting to a 3-foot tank or larger. And so anytime I hit that 36-inch long aquarium, I've got at least 2 sponge filters in that tank. Obviously I don't over there yet, and I don't up there, but I had a hang-on back filter running over there back when that was a heavily stocked aquarium. But as these tanks get rescaped, all the 40 breeders will have 2 sponge filters, just because it maximizes gas exchange, reduces the likelihood that we're going to have dead spots in the aquarium where you've just got detritus building up in one area, because the sponge filters, again, they don't do the greatest job of mechanical filtration. And so you'll come around over here and you'll see on that 75 gallon there's 2 sponge filters. Well, there's a whole mess load in this 60 breeder. Again, that's just because we've got filters that are just going through and making sure that they're still cycled. If this was not a display tank and I didn't have that Shark Pro internal canister filter in there, this would also have 3 sponge filters. And so I've got 2 in this 125, but by the time I get to a 6-foot tank, usually, if it's not a display tank, I would have 1 right there in the center, and they would be the big ATI Hydro 5s. And so the moral of the story is, if I were running just sponge filters as I am right now, and by the way, I only think this is useful if you've got a bunch of aquariums like we do here in this fish room. So if I pan back here, yeah, right now we've still got a bunch of aquariums, and we will have a bunch of aquariums up and running, and this is the most economical way to do this. But if I only had a few aquariums, I would not run sponge filters, because I don't necessarily like the way they look, and I don't like the fact that they do a relatively poor job of mechanical filtration. I would just pick, depending on the size of the tank, either a hang-on back or an internal or external canister filter. So 10 gallons, Hydro 1s, there's the size. 20 gallons, whether it's a standard 20 or a 20 long, I'm running Hydro 2s, that's the size. Once I get into the 40 gallon breeders, I like to run dual Hydro 4s. That would be the same thing I would do if I had a 55 gallon, would be the dual Hydro 4s. 75 gallons, I like to run dual Hydro 5s. By the time I get to a 6-foot tank, I'm running 3 Hydro 5s in that tank. And so that's basically what I'm doing with the sponge filters. And again, flow, I like to run a little bit more flow. It's going to be a little bit more noisy. You could put airstones in these sponge filters, and that would quiet them down quite a bit. The problem is there's always a drawback to everything. When you put airstones in the sponge filter, and so basically in that sponge filter right there, internally there would be an airstone. It would break up those bubbles, make them a little bit finer. But then what happens is the airstones start to clog inside the sponge filters. It doesn't happen right away, but usually after about a year or so, you're going to find yourself having to not only clean the sponge filters, which we do weekly, but pretty soon you're having to clean out those airstones because they get clogged and reduce the flow, even if the sponge filter itself is relatively clean. And so again, that's just something to consider. There's no right or wrong answer. If you want to use airstones to break up that bubble a little bit, you can. If you want to put the Uplift tubes in, that's certainly fine. There's Uplift tube extensions that will kind of curve over, cuts down on the noise a little bit. That will increase the flow through the sponge filter. But if you don't have them on there and somebody tells you, oh, they're not working, that is absolutely not true. They work just fine. As you can see here, we've got a couple sponge filters in there, and the water's crystal clear. Now, not a lot of fish, but even in the ones where we've got more fish over here, we've got, oh, look at that, still okay. We've got the multi-tank over here where we've got a couple of sponge filters in here, pretty heavily stocked, works perfectly fine. So you can run those either way. The only thing I would say is if you wind up with a situation like this, this sponge filter needs to be replaced. You can see here the sponge material is in pretty bad shape. And once it starts to sag and the center piece of the sponge filter itself gets exposed, well, at that point, the sponge filter is really not doing much anymore. So just kind of keep that in mind. All right, everyone, so hopefully that gives you a little bit more direction. If you want to learn more about how we clean our sponge filters, check out that video in the upper right-hand corner. If you want to learn more about sponge filters, look at the video in the lower right-hand corner. As always, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.